What would you do if Marvin Gaye walked into your wedding ceremony and stopped everything on June 15th, 1971? That's exactly what happened to two strangers in Detroit. What he did next wasn't just unexpected, it became the most magical moment in the history of the East Side Community Center. And 50 years later, their grandson revealed why that one moment changed three generations of their family forever. It was a Wednesday evening in Detroit, and the city was pulsing with the energy of Motown's golden era. The auto plants were running three shifts, the music scene was exploding, and in a small recording studio on West Grand Boulevard, Marvin Gaye had just finished working on tracks for what would become his revolutionary What's Going On album. He was at the peak of his artistic powers, having already changed the world with songs that spoke to the soul of America. But what nobody knew was that in the modest East Side Community Center, just 15 minutes from Hitsville, USA, something much more intimate was taking place. A young couple, Robert and Diana Johnson, were about to get married. They weren't wealthy. They weren't connected to the music industry. They were just two kids in love who had saved every penny they had to afford a simple ceremony in their neighborhood. Robert was 25 years old, a line worker at the Ford River Rouge plant. Diana was 23, a secretary at Detroit General Hospital with dreams bigger than her paycheck. They had $280 to their name, and they'd spent $140 of it just to rent the community center for 3 hours. There was no band, no professional singer, no fancy decorations, just a room with folding chairs, a small altar decorated with plastic flowers from Woolworth's, and a minister from their local Baptist church who had already performed 4 weddings that month. Diana's sister Gloria had taken time off from her job at Hudson's department store to be there. Robert had no family present. His parents had moved back to Mississippi years earlier, and his younger brother was serving in Vietnam. This wedding was supposed to be simple, quiet, and meaningful. Say their vows, take a few photos with Gloria's Polaroid camera, and head to their small apartment on the east side. That was the plan. Marvin Gaye had finished his session at Hitsville around 6:30 p.m. Berry Gordy had left early, and most of the other artists and producers had gone home for the day. Marvin usually would have headed straight to his house in the suburbs, but that evening he felt restless. The weight of creating music that addressed social issues, the pressure of following up his previous successes, and the general intensity of the times had him feeling contemplative. He decided to take a drive through the neighborhoods where he'd grown up, something he did when he needed to remember his roots. As Marvin drove slowly down Gratiot Avenue in his Cadillac DeVille, he noticed something that made him pull over. Outside the East Side Community Center, he saw a young woman in a simple white dress sitting on the front steps. She was crying. Not the happy tears you see at weddings, but the kind of tears that come from deep disappointment. Standing next to her was a young man in a dark suit that looked like it had been pressed and repressed until the fabric shone. He was trying to comfort her, but he looked just as heartbroken. Marvin turned off his engine and sat in his car for a moment, watching. The woman wiped her eyes with a tissue that looked like it had already been used too many times. The man pulled her close and whispered something in her ear that seemed to make her cry harder. Then Marvin heard it, carried on the warm Detroit evening air. Just a few words, but they hit him like a bolt of lightning. "I'm so sorry, Bobby. I know you wanted to give me more. I know you wanted live music and flowers and everything beautiful, but this is enough. You're enough for me." That's when Marvin Gaye made a decision that would change 4 lives forever. He got out of his car and walked directly toward the couple. Robert and Diana looked up, startled. For a moment, they didn't recognize him. They were too consumed by their own emotions, too wrapped up in their disappointment. But when Marvin spoke, his voice was unmistakable, warm and rich like velvet. "Excuse me, folks. I couldn't help but notice you two look like you're heading somewhere special." Diana's eyes went wide. She grabbed Robert's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. "Oh my Lord, Bobby, that's Marvin Gaye." Robert stammered, his voice shaking. "Mr. Gaye, we're sorry if we're blocking the sidewalk or anything." Marvin smiled, that gentle smile that had charmed millions. "You're not blocking anything at all, brother. In fact, I think I might be the one in the way. Am I right in thinking you two are about to tie the knot?" Diana nodded, still in shock. "Yes, sir. In about 10 minutes, right here in the community center." Marvin looked at her dress, simple but beautiful, then at Robert's suit, clearly his best and only, then at Gloria, standing in the doorway holding a small bouquet of daisies that looked like they'd been picked from someone's garden. "And let me guess," Marvin said, his voice gentle and understanding. "You're doing this without all the fancy extras. No musicians, no professional singer, just you two and love." Robert felt embarrassed but tried to stand straighter. "We don't have much money, Mr. Gay, but we have each other. That's what really matters." Marvin put his hand on Robert's shoulder, and Robert could feel the sincerity in that touch. "You know what, young man? You're absolutely right. That is what matters most. But here's the thing." He paused, looking between the two of them. "I grew up not far from here. I know what it's like to want to give someone you love the world, but only have your heart to offer. And I also know that sometimes when you least expect it, a little magic shows up to help things along." Diana was crying again, but this time they were different tears entirely. "Mr. Gay, are you saying—" "I'm saying," Marvin interrupted gently, "that I've got nowhere I need to be right now, and I can't think of a better way to spend my evening than making sure you two have a wedding that's as beautiful as your love for each other. If you'll have me, I'd be deeply honored to sing at your ceremony." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Robert couldn't find his voice. Diana covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Gloria dropped the bouquet and had to catch herself against the doorframe. You want to sing at our wedding?" Robert finally managed to whisper. "I don't just want to," Marvin said with that characteristic warmth in his voice. "I need to. Trust me on this. Now come on, we've got a ceremony waiting, and I've got some music in my soul that's just dying to come out." What happened next became the stuff of legend in Detroit's East Side community. Marvin Gaye, one of the biggest stars in the world, walked into that modest community center. The minister, Reverend Williams, nearly dropped his Bible when he saw who was entering his ceremony. Marvin didn't ask permission. He didn't make a grand announcement. He simply walked to the front of the room, positioned himself near the small altar, and nodded respectfully to Robert and Diana. "All right, folks, let's get these two beautiful people married." The ceremony began with about 20 friends and neighbors in attendance, all of them suddenly realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Reverend Williams stumbled through his lines at first, clearly nervous with Marvin Gaye standing just a few feet away from him. Robert held Diana's hands, both of them trembling not just from nerves, but from the surreal beauty of the moment. Gloria sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe what was happening to her sister. And then came the moment that would be remembered and talked about for 5 decades. When Reverend Williams said, "You may kiss the bride," Marvin Gaye began to sing. He sang "You're All I Need to Get By," without a microphone, without a band, without anything except his voice and his heart. The acoustics in that small community room made his voice sound like it was coming from heaven itself. Every word was filled with so much genuine emotion, so much warmth and love, that it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a prayer, like a blessing, like the universe itself was celebrating this union. Diana buried her face in Robert's chest and sobbed with joy. Robert held her tight, his own eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. Gloria was openly weeping. Even Reverend Williams had to pause and wipe his eyes. The neighbors and friends who had come to support the couple sat in stunned silence, knowing they were witnessing something that would never happen again. When Marvin finished the song, the room was silent except for the sound of people trying to compose themselves. Then he walked over to the newlyweds and shook Robert's hand firmly. "Congratulations, Mr. Johnson. You take good care of this lady. She's something special." Then he turned to Diana and gently took her hand. "And you, Mrs. Johnson, you've got yourself a good man here. I can see it in his eyes. You two are going to have a beautiful life together." Diana found her voice, though it was shaky with emotion. "Mr. Gay, I don't know how we can ever thank you for this." Marvin smiled that warm smile again. "You don't need to thank me, sister. Just love each other every day. That's all the thanks I need." He paused, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. He counted out several bills and handed them to Robert. "Now I want you two to go somewhere nice for dinner tonight, somewhere with tablecloths and candles. Celebrate this day properly." Robert looked at the money in his hand and his eyes widened. It was $150, more than he made in a week at the plant. "Mr. Gay, we can't accept this." "Yes, you can," Marvin said firmly but kindly. "And you will. Consider it a wedding gift from one Detroit family to another. Now go enjoy your wedding night, and congratulations again." Marvin Gaye walked out of that community center as quietly as he had arrived. He got back in his Cadillac, drove home to his family, and never mentioned the incident to anyone at Motown. He didn't call Berry Gordy about it. He didn't tell any reporters. He didn't use it for publicity. He simply did it because it felt like the right thing to do. Because in that moment, he saw two young people who deserved some magic in their lives, and he had the power to provide it. Robert and Diana Johnson left the Eastside Community Center that night, walking on air. They used Marvin's gift to have dinner at the London Chop House downtown, a place they had only ever dreamed of entering. They ordered wine, steak, and dessert. They talked about what had just happened, replaying every moment, every word, every note of that incredible song. "Do you think anyone will believe us when we tell them?" Diana asked, still in disbelief herself. Robert laughed, a sound filled with pure joy. "Probably not, but I don't care. We know what happened. We were there. That's all that matters." But here's the incredible part of this story, the part that nobody knew until 50 years later. Marvin Gaye's act of kindness didn't just give them a beautiful wedding memory, it changed the entire trajectory of their lives. That night, sitting in that fancy restaurant, looking out at the lights of Detroit, Robert and Diana made a promise to each other. They promised that they would never forget what Marvin Gaye had done for them, and they promised that whenever they had the opportunity, they would do the same kind of thing for someone else. They would look for people who needed a little magic, a little kindness, a little help, and they would provide it without expecting anything in return. Over the next 5 decades, Robert and Diana Johnson became legendary in their Detroit neighborhood for their generosity. Robert worked his way up at Ford, eventually becoming a supervisor, but he never forgot his roots. They paid for strangers' groceries when they saw people counting coins at the checkout. They helped young couples with wedding expenses. They donated to every church fundraiser and community cause. They opened their home to relatives who needed a place to stay, to friends who were down on their luck, to anyone who needed help. When the auto industry hit hard times in the 1980s and 1990s, the Johnsons organized food drives and job fairs. When young people in their neighborhood couldn't afford to go to college, Robert and Diana found ways to help with tuition. When elderly neighbors couldn't maintain their homes, they organized work parties. Their kindness became so well known that people would seek them out when they were in trouble, knowing that somehow, some way, the Johnsons would find a way to help. Their children grew up watching this behavior and naturally adopted it themselves. Their son Michael became a social worker. Their daughter Patricia became a nurse. Both chose careers focused on helping others, inspired by the example their parents set every day. Their grandchildren learned the same values, grew up understanding that having the ability to help someone meant you had the responsibility to do so. The ripple effect of what Marvin Gaye did in that community center on June 15, 1971, spread across 3 generations and touched hundreds of lives. But through all of those years, through all of that giving, Robert and Diana never told anyone the complete story. Not their children, not their closest friends, not even their pastor. They kept Marvin Gaye's kindness as their own private treasure, something sacred between the two of them, until 2021. On June 15, 2021, exactly 50 years after their wedding, Robert and Diana's family threw them a massive anniversary celebration. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren all gathered at the same community center where they had been married. It had been renovated over the years, but it was still the heart of the neighborhood. The celebration was beautiful, a testament to a marriage that had lasted half a century and had been filled with love, service, and generosity. During the party, their grandson Marcus stood up to give a speech. He talked about his grandparents' incredible generosity, their unwavering kindness, their love for each other and for everyone around them. And then he said something that made the entire room fall silent. "I never understood where Grandma and Grandpa learned to be so giving," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the room. "They always just said it was the right thing to do, that we should help people when we can. But last month, while helping Grandma clean out some old photo albums, I found something that changed everything I thought I knew about their wedding day. Marcus pulled out an old Polaroid photograph, faded and slightly blurry, but clearly showing three people at the front of a room. This is from their wedding, and on the back, in Grandma's handwriting, it says, "The day Marvin saved us." He held up the photograph, and even after 50 years, it was clear as day. Marvin Gaye, standing next to Robert and Diana in that small community center. "So I asked Grandma about it," Marcus continued, his voice shaking with emotion, "and she told me a story that I'll never forget as long as I live." Diana, now 73 years old but still elegant, stood up slowly. Robert, 75, and using a walker after a stroke 3 years earlier, stood beside her with the help of his son. And for the first time in 50 years, they told the complete story of what Marvin Gaye had done for them on their wedding day. The room was absolutely silent as they spoke. Some people cried. Some people shook their heads in amazement. But everyone understood finally why Robert and Diana had spent their entire lives giving to others, why kindness seemed to flow from them as naturally as breathing. "Marvin Gaye didn't just sing at our wedding," Robert said, his voice still strong despite his age. "He taught us what it means to be truly generous. He didn't do it for attention. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it because he owed us anything. He did it because he saw two young people who needed a little magic in their lives, and he had the power to provide it. That lesson shaped everything we became," Diana added, her voice filled with emotion. "Every time we helped someone over the years, every time we gave when we didn't have much to give ourselves, we thought about that night. We thought about Marvin standing in that little room, singing with all his heart for an audience of 20 people he'd never met. That's real love. That's real generosity. And that's what we wanted our lives to represent." The story of Marvin Gaye stopping that wedding spread quickly after the anniversary party. Marcus posted about it on social media, and within days it had been shared thousands of times. Local news outlets picked it up. Music historians researched it. Former Motown employees came forward with their own memories of Marvin's quiet acts of kindness. One former Hitsville studio engineer, now 82 years old, said, "I remember Marvin coming in the next day after that wedding. He was humming 'You're All I Need to Get By' to himself, and he had this peaceful look on his face, like he'd just done something that made him really happy. When I asked him if he'd had a good evening, he just smiled and said, 'I remembered why music matters.' I never knew what he meant until I read this story." A former neighbor of Marvin's recalled, "There were always stories in the neighborhood about Marvin helping people quietly, paying someone's rent, buying groceries for a struggling family, giving kids money for school clothes. He never wanted credit for it, said it wasn't about him. This wedding story doesn't surprise me at all. That's just who he was when nobody was watching. But for Robert and Diana Johnson, it was never about the celebrity or the fame. It was about the lesson they learned that night about what it means to use whatever power you have to lift others up." In one of the final interviews Robert gave before he passed away in 2023, he was asked what he would say to Marvin Gaye if he could see him again. Robert smiled, that same smile he had on his wedding day 52 years earlier. "I would tell him thank you, not just for the song, though that was the most beautiful gift anyone ever gave us, but thank you for showing us that success doesn't mean anything if you don't use it to help others. Thank you for seeing two scared kids and deciding we mattered. Thank you for being the kind of man who would stop his evening to make two strangers feel loved and important." He paused, his eyes misty with memory. "And I would tell him that because of what he did, we spent 50 years trying to be a little bit like him. We tried to see people who needed help, and we tried to provide it. We weren't famous. We didn't have his talent or his money, but we had his example. And that changed everything." The story of Marvin Gaye and the Johnson wedding is more than just a heartwarming tale. It's a reminder of what true generosity looks like. It's not about grand gestures for the cameras. It's not about getting credit or building your reputation. It's about seeing a moment where you can make a difference in someone's life and choosing to act. Even when nobody's watching, even when you'll never see those people again. Marvin Gaye never publicized what he did that night. He never mentioned it in interviews. He never used it to enhance his public image. He simply did it because it was the right thing to do, because he saw two young people who deserved some joy on the most important day of their lives. And that, perhaps more than any song he ever recorded or any award he ever won, is the real legacy of Marvin Gaye. Not just the music that changed the world, but the quiet acts of kindness that changed individual lives, one person at a time. Today, the East Side Community Center where Marvin Gaye sang for Robert and Diana Johnson is still there, still serving the neighborhood. There's a small plaque now that tells the story of what happened there in 1971. But the real memorial to that night lives on in the 3 generations of the Johnson family, in the hundreds of people they've helped over the years, and in everyone who hears this story and decides to do something kind for a stranger. Because that's what Marvin Gaye taught us that night in Detroit. Love is all we need to get by, and sometimes when we're lucky enough to have something to give, we should give it with our whole hearts, expecting nothing in return except the joy of knowing we've made someone else's life a little brighter. That's real soul music. That's the sound of love in action. And that's a song that never stops playing.